Afghanistan's Taliban government has formally adopted a set of morality laws. Among other rules, it requires women to cover their faces and men to grow their beard. But many argue it's a violation of personal freedoms. So what are the long-term implications of this law? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Hashem, Ahelbarra. When the Taliban swept back into power 3 years ago, it took over a country in which the civil and political rights of Afghans were enshrined in the constitution. But since then, many of those rights have been eroded, especially for women and girls. Now, Taliban officials have published a new set of morality laws, which will, in their words, promote virtue and prevent vice. The new laws range from requiring women to cover their faces and men to grow beards to banning music in cars. It comes at a time when the Afghan economy is in dire situation. Malnutrition rates are at a record highs and the healthcare system is nearing collapse. So will this latest crackdown further isolate the Taliban, and what impact will it have on the lives of millions of Afghans who are already struggling to survive? Plenty to discuss, but first this report from Victoria Gattenby.
Fighters and supporters of the Taliban, which now calls itself the Islamic Emirate, celebrating 3 years in power. Days later, the government issued new laws designed to, in its words, combat vice and promote virtue. According to the new rules, which cover all aspects of Afghan society, men must grow beards, music is banned, as is the publication of images of living things, and women are not allowed to sing, recite or read aloud in public. They are required to cover their faces. Al Jazeera has spoken to an Afghan woman who wants to remain anonymous. She protests against the Taliban by spray painting images of the now banned Afghan national flag onto buildings.
Every day they strip away our dignity, identity, and even our existence as human beings. And the world remains silent in the face of this collective massacre of women's rights.
The Taliban has consolidated its power since retaking control in August 2021. Girls and women have already been banned from secondary and higher education, and most women are not allowed to work. The UN says the Taliban has erased Afghan women from public life.
3 years ago, a woman in Afghanistan could technically decide to run for president. Now, she may not even be able to decide when to go and buy groceries. Now, I'm not saying that 3 years ago it was perfect. It was not perfect. But it wasn't this.
While the overall security situation has improved, the economy has shrunk by nearly 27% since the Taliban takeover. International funding, which previously covered more than half of public spending, has been cut off. Millions more Afghans now live in poverty, with more than 6 million internally displaced.
There is no work in our country, and many people are unemployed. They are forced to migrate to Iran and Pakistan. If there were good job opportunities in our country, no one would want to leave.
The Taliban says it's trying to resurrect an economy from scratch, but needs international help. The introduction of morality laws, which many rights groups argue violate the personal freedoms of Afghans, makes the Taliban government's struggle for global recognition even less likely to succeed. Victoria Gattenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
We'll bring in our panel in just a moment, but first let's speak to Walid Karyab. He's a human rights activist and political analyst based in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Walid, what was your first reaction to the new morality laws that were introduced in Afghanistan?
Hi, thanks for having me here. When I first heard about this on Wednesday, so I've just shocked that because I'm living here in Kabul, Afghanistan. I brought up here. I know the culture, my religion, my values. So unfortunately, it is misinterpreted and the basic thing, the most important thing in here is the right interpretation of our religion. So there were some rules, for example, playing of music are banned, and the men are not allowed to shave their beards, and the drivers are not allowed to transport the women without guardians. So the most important thing is not with playing the music. The content is important according to our religion and values. If the content is encouraging people to a wrong path, so it would be problematic.
Okay.
There are good singers, so in our religion, that they are famous, like some Yusuf, but they have lyrics, Islamic lyrics with music. It doesn't have problems. So they are just implementing the harsh version of our religion, which is not in real in our religion. And also 2 million people have been killed.
Before we go into that, I would just like to ask you, how is this new law going to affect your life and the lives of millions of young Afghans like yourself?
It will affect not only my life, but many other Afghans, especially the women, because 2 million people have been killed in Soviet occupation, and even over 20 years war in Afghanistan, thousands have been killed. So their brothers and husbands, they wounded and killed. So there are women, they are alone, they are just running their home. They're not allowed to work, they're not allowed to educate. So they're compelled to go to hospital, to any other places, and they don't have garden. So what they should do? So they are just putting many restrictions, and just day by day. At first, when they came, they took power. We were hopeful that the situation was a little bit normal. But in the passage of time, they are just putting restrictions. And I'm not sure that by putting these restrictions, the United Nations will easily recognize this government. So I want from this government to change the rules and regulations to reopen the schools and the restrictions for women especially.
What do you think will be the reaction of the Afghan people? Do you think that they will resist these laws and just they will continue living their own lives? Or do you think that life is going to be extremely difficult for people in the future against the backdrop of these new morality laws?
The basic problem here in Afghanistan is the lower level of education, that people are not well educated. So if the majority is not educated, they won't raise their voice against the laws, which is not acceptable for men and women in Afghanistan. The second problem is the fear. So they are afraid of the reaction of the government, that if they raise their voice, if they react, so they will be punished. So therefore, they are just silent and they just bear these problems. But as Afghan, as a Muslim, I raise my voice everywhere, anytime, because it's my responsibility. I am educated and I will educate till I'm alive. So I know that the real Islam and the real right of our individuals, that they should, men and women are equal in our religion. So they have the right to educate, to work, social rights. Every right is in common, and it's equal between men and women, but they are not identical.
Let's bring in our guest in California, Mariam Solaimankhil, a member of Afghanistan's parliament in exile and board member of Afghan Peace Watch, an NGO that monitors the situation in Afghanistan. In Glenwood, Maryland, Bahar Jalali, assistant teaching professor at Loyola University Maryland, where she researches Afghan modern history and women's rights. In Berlin, Mursal Wardak, an education and women's rights advocate and law student in Germany. Welcome to the program. Mariam, what was your first reaction when you heard about these new laws implemented in Afghanistan? The government is saying what we're doing is absolutely right, legitimate, because this is in line with the interpretation of Islamic Sharia law.
I was heartbroken, but I wasn't shocked. Why is anyone shocked? There is no such thing as a Taliban 2.0, which the world has tried to sell us for the last few years. It's as if you would try to rebrand the Nazis or the KKK and say that, you know what, they've changed. The Taliban proved themselves in the 90s, and now we're seeing who they are, and slowly their mask is coming off. So it's no surprise to me. I'm heartbroken for my sisters, though.
Bahar, what do you think they are coming back to these morality laws? Could this be an indication that it's the very hawkish members of the Taliban establishment taking over and telling the international community we're reverting back to the norm?
Mariam covered many good points. Of course, I'm also sad but not shocked. I'm a historian, so I would like to address this from a historical perspective. Most importantly, I want to emphasize that what the Taliban are doing, Taliban 1.0, 2.0, whatever you want to call it, in the 90s and today, has nothing to do with Afghan culture, Afghan customs, or Afghan history. Historically, there have been many reform periods led by modernist elites, Afghan-led modernism led by Afghans for Afghans, and historically, Afghan governments have had a very hands-off approach when it comes to interfering in people's personal lives, especially the rights of women. It's been a very sensitive area. So I think the most important message that I want to get across is that this has nothing to do with Afghan culture. And unfortunately, there have been some efforts to label the Taliban and their draconian decrees as somehow embedded in Afghan culture. And it's absolutely not. And their radical leaders, their hawkish leaders, they're simply doing the bidding of their sponsors, which they've always been doing, which is to erase Afghan history and attack Afghanistan's cultural heritage. So really to make Afghanistan disappear by, killing the population slowly.
Mursal, so women will have to be fully covered. They will have to have male guardians. Men should abstain. Everybody should abstain from listening to music. Weddings will have to be pretty much controlled. Personal freedoms will have to be controlled. There will be warnings to people, and if they don't abide by the rules, they will have to face courts in the future. How do you see Afghanistan in the upcoming years?
Well, I think that's very distressing and alarming. I don't know. They started first with the very little steps of banning women their rights to education, and now they're silencing their voices in public. I don't know how far this will go, and then I don't think it could get any worse than this. But I could imagine a future for Afghanistan where there is no home for people who have a bit of positivity, optimism, or any kind of good intention towards the country. That will not look like a good country, and that will not look like a civilized society at any point.
Mariam, there is a sense within the Taliban that what they are doing is to preserve the piety of the Muslim Ummah and Muslims, particularly in Afghanistan. But when you look at the Afghan society itself and the different people, ethnic groups, north, west, east, totally embracing different culture, embracing their own diversity. What does it mean for Afghanistan? Are we likely to move towards a one mindset, which is going to be now dictated by the Taliban for as long as it takes?
Well, you hit a very important point right now, and I have to go back to what Bahar said. This isn't a reflection of Afghan culture. This isn't our identity. And Afghanistan, and the word Afghan, is the definition is a melting pot of all of these beautiful cultures and languages and religions. We have Afghan Jews, we have Afghan atheists, we have Afghan Hindus and Sikhs and Shias and Sunnis. We have different sects. And what's happening is that the Taliban have been trying to rule by fear. They want to make a North Korea, an Islamic North Korea, where we're located, and it's scary because this is going to go back into the Middle East. You're going to see this in Islamic nations, where this new version of Islam that was made in a certain country, a neighboring country of Afghanistan, and being forced upon our people. Is gaining traction. Is this the real version of Islam? We really have to question that. And hopefully the world stands up and voices it, because the Afghan people are living at the point of a gun. We're not going to hear the truth of what's happening until we see some Human Rights Watch, until we see some Amnesty International, until we see some UN on the ground, making a safe space for the Afghan nation to speak what the truth is. And this is not our people. This is not our culture.
Bahar, this strict interpretation of the Islamic Sharia law has been abandoned across many, many countries in the Muslim world, to the point where it's seen as now completely irrelevant. But for the Taliban, this is very important to preserve the identity. Why do you think they're doing this? Is it for a purely political motive to tell the international community there is Taliban and this is therefore the way of life for us?
Yes, so I would like to add that there's no question that this is not Islam. I teach a course, Women and Gender in the Middle East, and even the Prophet of Islam was married to divorced women. Most of his wives had been married before. When the Taliban came to power, they even issued decrees that they rescinded divorce decrees that were granted under the Republic. The Taliban's imposition of these draconian decrees, of course, anyone with a very shallow education in Islam knows that things like right to education, female property ownership, the right to divorce, the right to have an early abortion are all embedded in Sharia. So, of course, it has nothing to do with Islam. It's purely political, purely strategic. And, of course, it goes all the way back to the long irredentist dispute between Afghan and Pakistan, where, we all know that the Taliban are a proxy force of Pakistan and basically trying to have that strategic depth. But going further now, not just having strategic depth, but really erasing Afghanistan, making it a colony, and doing so in the most draconian ways. And I do think that what your earlier guest said is because many people in Afghanistan are not educated about their rights, not educated about their Islamic rights. They want to spin this Islamic. It's absolutely not. And any rudimentary reading of Islam will tell you that.
We've been in touch with senior Taliban officials to join the show, but they said they declined to take part. And Mursal, this is a critical moment for the Taliban themselves because they were hoping to see some sort of international consensus about their authority as a legitimate government in Afghanistan. But the international community has been saying that will not happen unless you reverse the key decision that you made about girls' education. You add this new law to it. The international community is furious. Do you think that this could just delay any hope for the Afghan people to have a better life against the backdrop of the extremely difficult economic situation?
Of course, I think I especially came from this country. I migrated to Germany for the hope that I will be returning to this country with a handful of something academics and with the hope to come back. But the prospect of returning homes feels increasingly remote now. The Afghanistan that existed before seems to be vanishing. And the fear is that by that no time, especially women can return, there will be a little bit resemblance to the life that once was. I don't think there is any hope, any source of hope that is remaining for people in here, and any kind of hope for people who are in Afghanistan to stay in that country.
Mariam, for at least, for the last few decades, we've seen women very active in society, thriving artists, entrepreneurs, teachers, professors, doctors who decided to stick around to help the poor and the needy. And those people, and those ladies in particular, will face uncertain times now. If you add to this the ban which has been imposed on girls' education, the UNESCO has been saying that the biggest threat that a generation of Afghan women will face, where does it leave women in Afghanistan?
Well, women in Afghanistan have no future. They don't even have a right to dream at this point. We came from a place where we had the highest percentage, one of the highest percentages of female parliament members in Afghan parliament. Our UN ambassador was a woman. Our US ambassador was a woman. We had ministers, we had artists, as you said. And at this point, women they can't even complain. The world is expecting Afghan women to stand up and voice their complaints and fight the Taliban when they've been completely abandoned. We have to remember that this was not a war that was won by the Taliban through fighting soldiers face to face. No, it was gifted to the Taliban by the United States on a silver platter. the way that Afghanistan crumbled was within weeks, and we saw that. And at this point, the responsibility falls on the global community to make a safe space for women to be able to speak. Women, this is not just a women's rights issue. This is over 20 million women. This is a human rights issue, and it is the largest human rights issue in the entire world. So I pray that this show and our voices get amplified, and the world gathers, and every woman on this planet gathers and raises their voice for the most oppressed population on the planet.
Bahar, the United Nations human rights investigator Richard Bennett has been banned access to Afghanistan. Now, you've started a protest online. Give us a sense of how people are reacting to your own outcry about the need to improve the lives of women in Afghanistan.
So I believe you're referring to the campaign that I started online 2021. Well, I think the reason why it received widespread global media coverage is because many Afghans shared my sentiments that when the Taliban came out with this never before seen dress code for Afghan women, it wasn't just an attack on their rights. It was an attack on Afghan identity, Afghan culture, Afghan history. It was an existential threat. And unfortunately, the reason why the Taliban have been emboldened to issue these draconian decrees is because to a significant extent, they have been normalized by the international community, meeting in glitzy forums and red carpet treatment. Why didn't they meet with them behind closed doors without giving them all this publicity, normalizing them? You've got Western tourists traveling to Afghanistan, taking selfies and posting it on Instagram, saying, hey, I met with the Taliban. So I do think that, like Mariam said, the international community has been very, enablers of this regime. And with that, Western kind of de facto recognition, de facto legitimacy, they have been emboldened to impose. And the ultimate victims are Afghan people, especially Afghan women.
Mursal, what do you think the international community should do about the new morality laws?
Well, I think we need some very critical actions from the national, international legal bodies, including the United Nations and International Criminal Court, to address the human rights violation, to recognize the gender apartheid there, the how terrifying it could get, and how much they could do something about it. I don't exactly know now what they could do, but the only thing that I have right now in mind is that not recognizing Taliban, of course, not forming any kind of diplomatic relations with them. That is going on right now in Doha and in most of the countries. And the other thing will be for the United Nations and the Criminal Court to do something about it.
Mariam, we're talking about depriving 1.4 million girls of the right to education. But if you add to it the figures from 2021, we're talking about almost 2.5 million girls who were school-age girls who were denied the right to education. Is this something that, irrespective of what happens politically today, tomorrow, or in 10, 15, 20 days, 20 years from now, will have profound repercussions on the Afghan society itself?
Well, why we have to question why the Taliban are stopping women from going to school, and we've had many discussions about this, and it always comes back to one point: an educated mother would never allow their son or daughter to be misused in the name of some political agenda that was made in Pakistan. So what's going to happen? There's going to be an influx in extremism. There's going to be an influx in terrorism. Afghanistan right now is a black zone. Anything can happen there. People are coming in from all over the world. There's no monitoring happening. No one knows who's there. We do know, Afghans on the ground do know, but there's no safe way for them to voice what's going on. So there's not just Afghan repercussions, there's not cultural repercussions and religious repercussions, but there's also global implications that can happen out of this as well. And we really need to keep an eye on this and raise our voices.
Bahar, you were talking earlier about the international community in a way or another emboldening the Taliban. They met with them with the hope to convince them to make some concessions. It doesn't seem to have helped at all. But do you think that the international community will have any sort of political leverage on the Taliban, given the circumstances now? The Taliban themselves, when you talk to them, they say, you know what, we are the ones who control the country. There's no one who has the guts whatsoever to say that they can challenge us in the near future, and therefore they believe that this is a genuine right for them to do whatever they want to do in Afghanistan.
Well, I think that it goes without saying that the international community has significant political leverage, but it has to demonstrate the will to exert it and implement it. And one of the few examples that I gave a few moments ago is, why are they meeting with the Taliban and giving them red carpet treatment at very high-profile gatherings, prestigious global platforms, red carpet treatment, all this publicity, photo ops, right? So at the very minimum, they can stop meeting with the Taliban publicly, meet with them behind closed doors, give them firm ultimatums. I mean, they're so bold now that they're even banning the UN Human Rights Rapporteur, Richard Bennett, from the country. I mean, that's the extent that they've been emboldened. So I do think it's time for the international community to change tact and to really stop this de facto recognition. And instead of just giving feeble and impotent statements about Taliban human rights violations, to actually show some tangible action with regards to dealing with them. And the Taliban are really just, they may talk big and have bravado, but I think that once they're dealt with firmly, they can easily, be, reduced to submission or completely out of the picture.
I see. Thank you. I really appreciate your insight. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but Mariam, Solaimankhil, Bahar Jalali, Mursal Wardak, I really appreciate your insight, and I promise you that we will definitely revisit this story again and again in the near future. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.